The Stranger by Chris Van Allsburg. A book we do have in our library. It is not a Primrose Reading Challenge book. Okay, in this book, pay careful attention to the illustrations, to the mood that the color palette gives you and what that might be saying, as well as pay attention to the angles. Are they, and to the framing, is it close up? Is it distanced? Is it from a high altitude or from a low altitude, or from a low angle? These things kind of create a mood and this extra layer of meaning, which is pretty important to this story. I won't say any more. I'm going to read. I've got to keep videos short. Okay. It was the time of year Farmer Bailey liked best, when summer turned to fall. He whistled as he drove along. A cool breeze blew across his face through the truck's open window. Then it happened. There was a loud thump. Mr. Bailey jammed on his brakes. Oh no, he thought. I've hit a deer. And if you're looking at the color palette there, browns, oranges, yellows, blacks, or very dark browns, very muted colors, which will stay throughout the story. But it wasn't a deer the farmer found lying in the road. It was a man. Mr. Bailey knelt down beside the still figure, fearing the worst. Then suddenly, the man opened his eyes. He looked up with terror and jumped to his feet. He tried to run off, lost his balance, and fell down. He got up again, but this time the farmer took his arm and helped him to the truck. And there we have the figure lying on the ground, hands out. He's dark. He is in darkness, which kind of symbolizes something. Mr. Bailey drove home. He helped the stranger inside, where Mrs. Bailey made him comfortable on the parlor sofa. Katie, their daughter, peeked into the room. The man on the sofa was dressed in odd, rough leather clothing. She heard her father whisper, "Must be some kind of hermit, sort of fellow who lives alone in the woods." The strangers didn't seem to understand the questions Mr. Bailey asked him. "I don't think," whispered Mrs. Bailey, "I don't think he knows how to talk." And there's the picture of Katie peeking in around the corner. Mr. Bailey called the doctor, who came and listened to the stranger's heart, felt his bones, looked in his eyes, and took his temperature. He decided the man had lost his memory. There was a bump on the back of his head. "In a few days," the doctor said, "he should remember who he is and where he's from." Mrs. Bailey stopped the doctor as he left the house. He'd forgotten his thermometer. "Oh, you can throw that out," he answered. "It's broken. The mercury is stuck at the bottom." Now, the mercury in a thermometer goes up to show temperature. So if the mercury is stuck at the bottom, the doctor assumes that the thermometer is broken. But what if? And there are lots of visual elements there to look at. The cats, the bird in the bird bath, the mother's hands just coming out from behind the frame. It's an unusual framing. The doctor with the glasses on, we can't see his eyes. There is an air of mystery throughout this book. Mr. Bailey lent the stranger some clean clothes. The fellow seemed confused about buttonholes and buttons. In the evening, he joined the Baileys for dinner. The steam that rose from the hot food fascinated him. He watched Katie take a spoonful of soup and blow gently across it. Then he did exactly the same. Mrs. Bailey shivered. "Brr," she said, "there's a draft in here tonight." And there's that image. We have this guy. He's at the table. He seems to be wide-eyed, like he's seeing everything for the first time. And chill in here. Again, this reference to cold. The next morning, Katie watched the stranger from her bedroom window. He walked across the yard, found 2 rabbits. Instead of running into the woods, the rabbits took a hop in his direction. He picked one of them up and stroked its ears, then set it down. The rabbits hopped away. then stopped and looked back as if they expected the stranger to follow. And now we've noticed that the stranger, not so much in the darker clothes, but there is a yellow and a blue, colors which symbolize certain things. When Katie's father went into the fields that day, the stranger shyly tagged along. Mr. Bailey gave him a pitchfork, and with a little patience he learned to use it well. They worked hard. Occasionally Mr. Bailey would have to stop and rest, but the stranger never tired. He didn't even sweat. And there's that beautiful scene of harvest, which tells us, like the color palette in the whole book, that it's autumn season, the time of harvest, the time at the end of summer into going into winter, all important. That evening, Katie sat with the stranger, watching the setting sun. High above them, a flock of geese, in perfect V formation, flew south on the trip that they made every fall. The stranger could not take his eyes off the birds. He stared at them like a man who had been hypnotized. It's interesting. Katie is looking up at the stranger. The cat is following the stranger's eyes up into the sky. 2 weeks passed and the stranger still could not remember who he was, but the Baileys didn't mind. They liked having the stranger around. He had become one of the family. Day by day he'd grown less timid. "He seems so happy to be around us," Mr. Bailey said to his wife. "It's hard to believe he's a hermit." There's that picture of them all having a good old hoedown or a dance. Interesting on that one. Another week passed. Farmer Bailey could not help noticing how peculiar the weather had been. Not long ago it seemed that autumn was just around the corner, but now it felt like summer, as if the seasons couldn't change. The warm days made the pumpkins grow larger than ever. The leaves on the tree were as green as they had been 3 weeks before. So autumn is not exactly coming. It's sort of frozen in time. Vegetables and fruit continue to grow. Trees keep growing green leaves. One day the stranger climbed the highest hill on the Bailey farm. He looked to the north and saw a puzzling sight. The trees in the distance were bright red and orange, but the trees to the south, like those around the Baileys, were nothing but shades of green. They seemed so drab and ugly to the stranger. It would be much better, he thought, if all the trees could be red and orange. Now that's, we call, seems to be a supernatural event. That the trees in the Bailey's farm remain green, while the trees away seem to be following a natural pattern. The stranger's feelings grew stronger the next day. He couldn't look at a tree's green leaves without sensing that something was terribly wrong. The more he thought about it, the more upset he became, until finally he could think of nothing else. He ran to a tree and pulled off a leaf. He held it in a trembling hand and, without thinking, blew on it with all his might. At dinner that evening, the stranger appeared dressed in his old leather clothes. By the tears in his eyes, the Baileys could tell that their friend had decided to leave. He hugged them all at once, then dashed out the door. The Baileys hurried outside to wave goodbye, but the stranger had disappeared. The air had turned cold, and the leaves on the trees were no longer green. We see that angle. Shadows, long shadows. Every autumn since the stranger's visit, the same thing happens at the Bailey farm. The trees that surround it stay green for a week after the trees to the north have turned. Then overnight, they change their color to the brightest of any tree around. And etched in frost on the farmhouse windows are words that say simply, "See you next fall." The end. Is it an unsatisfying end? Is it a satisfying end? Does it all clue up? Are answers given? Is there clarity? Not really. But are you okay with that? That's the question. Okay, I gotta stop this video. Have a look at the task underneath. Thanks.